Philippines, August 1945. The air was thick and heavy, a humid blanket that clung to skin and clothing, carrying the faint metallic tang of recent conflict and the sweeter, sickly sweet scent of decay from the war-torn outskirts of Manila. Above it all, the persistent, rhythmic drum of tropical rain hammered against tin roofs and lush foliage, a ceaseless lament for the lives irrevocably altered. In a makeshift encampment, cobbled together from salvaged corrugated iron and tattered canvas, 23-year-old Hana traced the faint, faded pattern on her tattered kimono. It was a silent ritual, a quiet act of defiance against the crushing weight of memory, a desperate clutching at a past that felt impossibly distant, a life long gone. The whispers among the newly liberated women, the survivors of the comfort stations, were low, hushed, and filled with a fragile uncertainty. They spoke of an unknown future, of shattered lives and the gaping void where dignity once resided. But more immediately, more acutely, they spoke of the strange, towering American soldiers whose boisterous laughter echoed through the camp, a sound as alien and incomprehensible as their language. Having endured unimaginable horrors designed to strip them of every shred of their humanity, leaving them hollowed out and desensitized, these women now faced an even greater paradox. The very men who had arrived as conquerors, whose presence signified yet another shift in power, offered them not further subjugation, not a new form of servitude, but something utterly unexpected, the delicate yet potent keys to a new world. They offered words, the building blocks of understanding, the very foundation of freedom. It was an offering that defied all their learned expectations, a bewildering turn in a life steeped in cruelty. Weeks prior to the American invasion, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a man whose features were as sharp and unyielding as his military uniform, surveyed his domain. He was the meticulous, unfeeling architect of the local comfort station logistics, a system he viewed with a detached, clinical gaze. His perspective was unburdened by empathy, devoid of moral qualms. For him, the women confined within those flimsy walls were not individuals with names, histories, or souls. They were war resources, essential, he believed, for maintaining the psychological and physical health of his troops, for preventing the disruptions that could erode fighting spirit. His doctrine, etched into his very being from years of rigorous military indoctrination and unquestioning loyalty to the imperial army, echoed the official chilling stance. These women were necessary sacrifices, their existence solely to serve the sacred cause of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Their comfort, in his mind, was a hygienic and psychological measure, a necessary evil, far removed from any concept of human dignity, love, or even basic respect. He saw them as interchangeable units, a service provided to the emperor's soldiers. The oppressive humidity of the Philippine summer was a constant, clinging like a shroud to everything. It carried with it a suffocating blend of scents, cheap, cloying perfume meant to mask the stench of fear, stale sweat, and the underlying metallic hint of desperation. The incessant, rhythmic drone of cicadas, a natural symphony of the tropics, was often abruptly punctuated by harsh, guttural Japanese commands. These sharp pronouncements cut through the air, followed by the muffled cries that sometimes escaped from within the flimsy, canvas-partitioned shacks. Hana, confined within these same walls, remembered with a chilling clarity the rough, impersonal texture of the thin futon upon which she was forced to lie. She remembered the cold, almost reptilian glint in Captain Tanaka's eyes whenever he passed, a look that stripped her of personhood. Most vividly, she remembered the terrifying, absolute silence that would fall over the women, a hush pregnant with unspoken fear, whenever a new high-ranking officer arrived, signifying yet another wave of dehumanizing encounters. It was Private Thomas "Tommy" O'Malley, a fresh-faced medic whose Brooklyn accent was as thick as his compassion was deep, who inadvertently initiated the first spark of something new, something dangerously akin to hope. The setting sun cast long, weary shadows across the camp as Tommy made his rounds, distributing meager rations to the emaciated survivors. He found Hana huddled in a corner, her slender frame almost swallowed by the shadows, her eyes distant. Her fingers were delicately tracing a small, crude drawing etched into the dirt, A simple, almost childlike outline of a butterfly, its wings broken. He approached cautiously, his army boots crunching softly on the gravel, and offered her a chocolate bar, its wrapper crinkling in the humid air. He managed an awkward, almost apologetic smile. She flinched, instinctively recoiling, her body tensing, expecting the usual demand, the inevitable price. But he simply placed the chocolate bar gently beside her, its rich, sweet scent a jarring contrast to the pervasive smell of despair, and moved on without another word, his shoulders slightly slumped. Later, from a distance, Hannah watched him. He was attempting to communicate with an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of suffering, using clumsy, exaggerated hand gestures. His frustration was clear, a visible cloud around him, but his patience, to Hannah's utter bewilderment, remained unwavering. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't demanding, he was simply trying. Hannah watched, a flicker of bewildered curiosity slowly replacing the stony fear that had become her constant companion. Around her, other women murmured, their voices low and uncertain. Some were suspicious, their gazes hardened by years of betrayal. Others openly wept, overwhelmed by the sheer, unexpected gentleness, a kindness they had almost forgotten existed. Tommy, for his part, felt a profound unease gnawing at him, a visceral guilt for the atrocities he was witnessing, for the hollowed-out eyes that met his own. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he couldn't fix the war, couldn't erase the past, but the sheer helplessness of their situation, the raw, exposed vulnerability of these women, struck him deeply. He knew he had to do something. Rough estimates circulated among the newly arrived American intelligence officers, cold, stark numbers that attempted to quantify the unimaginable. Over 200,000 women from various Asian countries had been forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. In this particular Manila camp, a place now etched into Tommy's memory, U.S. intelligence estimated at least 80 women had been held captive, their youth stolen, for an average of 3 years. Chillingly had been as young as 14 when their nightmare began. Reports on the conditions of liberated civilians in the Manila sector from August 1945 emphasized the severe psychological state of the women found in the designated comfort stations, noting that many were disoriented, malnourished, and exhibited extreme trauma, with communication proving a critical barrier to their processing and rehabilitation. A few days later, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of Hannah's peripheral vision. It was Tommy, not with another chocolate bar, not with food, but with something far more intriguing, a small, worn pocketbook, its pages dog-eared and slightly damp from the persistent humidity. He approached her cautiously, his movements slow, deliberate, a stark contrast to the usual brusqueness she had come to expect from men in uniform. He pointed a broad finger at a word printed clearly on one of the pages. Hello. Then slowly, carefully, he made a universal gesture of greeting, a slight nod of his head accompanied by an uncertain but kind smile. Hannah stared, her eyes wide, like a startled deer caught in an unexpected beam of light. She didn't understand the strange sounds, the foreign marks on the page, but the gesture, the soft tone of his voice, spoke a language she had almost forgotten. Gentleness. After a long, tense moment of silence, a fragile, almost imperceptible smile touched the very corners of her lips, a ghost of a forgotten emotion. Slowly, painfully, she echoed the sound, her voice a reedy whisper. Halo. It was barely audible, yet it was a word spoken, an acknowledgement offered. At the time, the vast majority of the local Filipino population, let alone the comfort women who had been systematically isolated from broader society, possessed only a rudimentary, if any, functional understanding of English beyond basic trading terms. The cultural and linguistic gap between these women and their American liberators was immense, a chasm that seemed impassable. Yet here, in this small, quiet interaction, a bridge was being built, one tentative sound at a time. Tommy later confided in his personal journal on August 28, 1945, about trying to teach her hello, noting the deer-like eyes but then a tiny spark, a sign that, it's a start, gotta be a start. This ain't right what happened to him. Someone's gotta help. Other women, their faces etched with suspicion and curiosity in equal measure, watched from a distance. News of the English soldier, the one who spoke softly and offered words instead of demands, began to spread like a faint, fragile rumor through the desolate camp. A seed of something new had been planted, tiny but persistent. Soon, the small, clandestine lessons began to take shape. Tommy, driven by an empathy he couldn't ignore, was joined by two other sympathetic GIs, Sergeant Miller, a quiet, observant man from the Midwest, and Private Rodriguez, a gregarious, good-humored fellow from California whose own family had known hardship. They started holding informal lessons in the dwindling twilight hours or during their precious off-duty shifts, always out of sight, always with a nervous glance over their shoulders. These were not formal classes but hesitant, often awkward exchanges, not just for Hannah, but for any woman brave enough to shed her fear and approach them. They used gestures, simple drawings scratched into the dust, and a single, worn-out English dictionary, its pages almost falling out from use. Their lessons were focused on survival English: food, water, doctor, safe. Words that might mean the difference between help and neglect in the chaotic aftermath of war. They risked reprimand, even court-martial for fraternizing with local nationals. But the raw need in the women's eyes outweighed the threat of military discipline. The soldiers' unofficial initiative, their quiet act of rebellion against the military's detached stance, led to a small but incredibly significant shift within the camp. Within a mere 2 weeks, a core group of approximately 15 women, led by Hannah's quiet determination, could not only understand, but also respond to basic English commands. This seemingly minor achievement was, in fact, a vital step in navigating the complex, often indifferent, post-war environment. It provided them with a rudimentary but critical tool for interacting with relief organizations, medical personnel, and the various military and civilian authorities who now controlled their uncertain futures. A former comfort woman, Kim Soo-jin, recalled in a 1998 interview, "The soldiers, they were different. They didn't want anything from us, only for us to learn. It was a kind of magic. Each word felt like a small key unlocking a cage." The women, once isolated by their trauma and language barrier, began to form a nascent community. It was a fragile bond, forged in the shared secret of their lessons and the growing sense of empowerment that each new word brought. Hannah, with her quick grasp of the new language, naturally emerged as an informal leader. She would translate for the others, her voice gaining strength with each new phrase, and gently urge the more timid women to participate. The soldiers, initially driven by a raw, instinctual empathy, found themselves deeply invested. Their hardened military stoicism, a shield against the horrors of war, began to chip away, revealing a profound and unexpected human connection. They weren't just teaching words, they were witnessing a rebirth of spirit. Inevitably, word of the unauthorized school began to filter through the ranks, reaching the ears of Lieutenant Colonel Davies. Davies was a man carved from regulation and procedure, a by-the-book officer, whose primary concern was order and efficiency. He had been tasked with the unenviable job of overseeing the complex and often messy repatriation of displaced persons, and he saw the soldiers' activities as a blatant breach of protocol, a potential security risk, and, perhaps most disturbingly, an emotional entanglement that was utterly detrimental to troop discipline. He had no time for sentimentality, especially when it jeopardized the structured hierarchy of military operations. His order was swift and unequivocal. The lessons were to stop immediately. The official military policy at the time, particularly regarding the highly stigmatized and politically sensitive issue of comfort women, was largely one of disengagement. The standard procedure was to pass responsibility to civilian aid organizations, a deflection often driven by a lack of clear directive from higher command, the overwhelming scale of the problem, and the immense social stigma surrounding victims of sexual slavery. Fewer than 1% of U.S. military personnel were explicitly trained in cultural sensitivity or language support for such specialized populations, leaving a vast void that men like Tommy, Miller, and Rodriguez had, unknowingly, attempted to fill. A memorandum dated September 10, 1945, from Lieutenant Colonel Davies to Captain E. Johnson explicitly stated that Private O'Malley and his men are to cease all unauthorized instruction with local nationals immediately. Such activities are not conducive to maintaining operational security or military decorum. Their focus must remain on their assigned duties. The women, who had just begun to taste a semblance of agency, a fragile thread of hope, were devastated. Their faces, which had started to regain a glimmer of life, clouded over once more with despair. The soldiers were conflicted, caught agonizingly between their sworn duty to follow orders and a burgeoning moral imperative that tugged fiercely at their consciences. Hannah, her chest tight with a renewed fear, but emboldened by her new, albeit broken words, confronted Tommy. Her voice was small but firm, cutting through the camp's murmur. "Why? Why stop?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. Her question, delivered in hesitant, broken English, carried more weight, more raw truth than any perfectly fluent protest could have. It was a question that demanded an answer, forcing the soldiers to make a choice that would define not only their duty, but their humanity. Lieutenant Colonel Davies's directive, intended to shut down a perceived problem, to re-establish military order and quash what he considered a dangerous sentimental indulgence, inadvertently became the precise catalyst for a quiet yet profound rebellion. His pronouncement, meant to be definitive, instead forced a moment of truth for Tommy, Miller, and Rodriguez. They looked at the women, their faces reflecting the renewed despair, and understood with a chilling clarity that following orders would mean abandoning these fragile souls to an uncertain future, leaving them adrift in a world they could not navigate, plunging them back into a despair perhaps even deeper than before. They saw with painful clarity that true liberation wasn't just about ending physical captivity. It was about restoring a stolen dignity, igniting agency, and providing the tools to rebuild shattered lives. The twist, the pivotal turning point, came when, instead of meekly complying with the colonel's command, they made a collective, unspoken decision to defy it. They chose to continue the lessons, but now in deeper secrecy, recruiting a few more sympathetic GIs who, like them, saw beyond regulations to the raw human need. They strategically utilized their off-duty hours, transforming what Davies considered fraternization into a clandestine humanitarian mission. They believed, with a conviction that resonated deep in their bones, that empowering these women with English was not merely an act of kindness, but a strategically valuable endeavor for their long-term rehabilitation and the overall stability of the region, far more impactful than any bureaucratic directive. The women, who had previously been passive recipients of fate, objects of circumstance, now became active, willing participants in their own secret education. Their initial fragile trust in the soldiers solidified into an unbreakable bond, forged in the shared risk and shared hope. The assumption held by so many that these women were burdens to be managed, unfortunate casualties of war, was utterly flipped on its head. They were not burdens, they were resilient survivors, capable of incredible self-determination, given the right tools. Each whispered word learned, each practiced phrase was a quiet testament to their indomitable spirit, a beacon of hope in the oppressive post-war gloom. The act of teaching English, seemingly benign, a simple exchange of knowledge, was, in truth, fraught with immense legal and ethical complexities. The official stance on comfort women within the Allied forces was a murky, ill-defined quagmire. While unequivocally recognized as victims of Japanese war crimes, there was no clear protocol for their rehabilitation. Military leadership, burdened by the immense logistical challenges of ending a global war and fearing potential political backlash or cultural misunderstandings, largely sidestepped the issue. For the soldiers involved, the risks were very real. Potential courts-martial for insubordination, for fraternization with local nationals, and for defying direct orders. Their careers, perhaps even their freedom, hung in the balance with each whispered lesson. Ethically, they grappled with the inherent power dynamic. Were they truly helping, or were they, perhaps unwittingly, imposing their own culture, their own language, their own solutions on a population already so traumatized? It was a nuanced question that haunted their quieter moments, yet the overwhelming evidence of the women's desperation, their hunger for understanding, pushed them forward. For the women, the psychological stakes were immeasurable. Learning a new language transcended mere vocabulary acquisition. It was a profound process of reclaiming identity, of rebuilding a self that had been systematically dismantled. Each new phrase, each successful communication, chipped away at the thick layers of trauma, shame, and silence that had been brutally forced upon them. It wasn't just about speaking, it was about finding a voice. It was a means to articulate their incomprehensible pain, to express their most basic needs, and incredibly, to begin to whisper their long-dormant aspirations. Hannah, for instance, learned a simple phrase that resonated deep within her soul: "I am not nameless." It became her personal mantra, a silent declaration of her restored personhood, a repudiation of the dehumanization she had endured. The lessons also fostered a powerful sense of collective purpose among the women, transforming them from isolated survivors into a supportive network, a sisterhood bound by shared trauma and shared hope. The ability to communicate directly with their liberators, to ask for medical help without the filter of an often unreliable translator, to understand their options for repatriation or resettlement. All of this fundamentally altered their immediate post-war trajectory. This direct link between their burgeoning literacy and their psychological recovery, their eventual societal reintegration, was undeniable. The stat of their newfound literacy, however rudimentary, was directly tied to the outcome of their healing process. It was a lifeline. Crucially, this newfound linguistic capability granted them an unprecedented advantage: the ability to verbally report their harrowing experiences in English to international aid workers and war crimes investigators. Instead of relying solely on often inadequate translators who might dilute or misinterpret their testimonies, they could now offer direct, unmediated accounts. This not only lent immense credibility to their stories, but also played a critical role in the early efforts to document these unspeakable atrocities, ensuring that their voices, finally, were heard clearly and unequivocally. Their quiet acts of learning became powerful acts of justice. The air in the makeshift camp was particularly tense one sweltering afternoon. The usual hum of cicadas seemed muted, overshadowed by a palpable sense of apprehension. A critical inspection, unannounced and heavily armed with an air of cold authority, had descended upon them. General Patton's stern, unsmiling figure, accompanied by a retinue of equally grim-faced officers from the Army's Provost Marshal's office, arrived in a plume of dust. Their mission: to crack down on lax discipline and to investigate the persistent, troubling rumors of unauthorized activities among the troops, specifically the alleged fraternization with local nationals. The battle for Tommy, Miller, and Rodriguez began with swift, separate interrogations. They were pulled from their duties, marched into a hastily converted tent, and grilled under the unforgiving glare of a single bare bulb. From Tommy's angle, the interrogation was a moral crucible. He stood before a stony-faced captain, his Brooklyn swagger replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He knew the regulations, knew the severe penalties, but as the captain barked questions about unauthorized contact, Tommy, without prior coordination with his comrades, chose to speak from the heart. He argued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, that their lessons were not a breach of discipline but an essential humanitarian effort, critical for the women's survival and rehabilitation. He made a passionate, albeit unauthorized, moral case against the rigid regulations, emphasizing that true soldiering sometimes meant protecting the most vulnerable, even if it meant bending the rules. "Sir," he said, his voice rising slightly, "these women were ghosts. We gave them words. We gave them a way to live again." Miller, the quiet Midwesterner, took a more pragmatic approach. His interrogation focused on the practicalities. He calmly explained how the rudimentary English skills developed by the women had inadvertently aided in basic camp management, in identifying medical needs, and even in gathering fragmentary intelligence from local informants who now trusted the American presence more deeply. He emphasized that the knowledge gained, far from being a distraction, had contributed to maintaining order and efficiency within the chaotic displaced persons camps. It was a strategic, if unorthodox, defense. Rodriguez, ever the diplomat, appealed to a deeper sense of humanity. He spoke of the sheer raw suffering he had witnessed, of the universal human need for connection and communication. He described how the women, initially catatonic with fear, had slowly blossomed under the simple act of learning. He argued that defying military protocol in this instance was not an act of defiance, but an act of profound compassion, a reflection of the very values the American Army claimed to uphold. He spoke of the soldiers' duty to protect, which extended beyond the battlefield to the broken lives left in its wake. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the soldiers, the more critical battle was unfolding in an adjacent tent. Hannah and a few other women, now proficient enough in basic English, were brought in for their own official questioning by the general's aides, an interpreter waiting stiffly in the corner. They were asked about the soldiers' conduct, about the nature of their interactions. Instead of simply answering the questions, Hannah, her heart pounding but her resolve firm, took a deep breath. With newfound confidence, she began to articulate, in clear, albeit accented English, the profound, transformative impact of the lessons. "They did not touch us," she stated, her voice steady, her eyes meeting the aides. "They gave us words. Words are hope." She explained how the language had not only given them a means to express their profound suffering to the aid workers, to identify their families, to plan for their futures, but had also, crucially, taught them dignity. "They taught us we are not nameless," she reiterated, her personal mantra now a public declaration. "They taught us we can speak for ourselves." Her unexpected fluency, her articulate testimony, sent a ripple of shock through the room, utterly disarming the investigators who had expected only vague, translated answers, or perhaps accusations of impropriety. The interpreter, rendered almost superfluous, simply nodded in stunned agreement. The general, a man hardened by years of war and deeply suspicious of any deviation from protocol, listened intently through a partially open flap. He had arrived prepared to impose severe disciplinary action, to make an example of these unruly GIs. But as he heard Hannah's testimony, her words cutting through the dry, bureaucratic reports, translated imperfectly by his aide but powerfully conveyed by her raw emotion and quiet strength, he found himself unexpectedly moved. He realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the soldiers, in their transgression, had achieved something that official policy, with all its regulations and forms, could never have accomplished. The battle was won not with weapons, but with the quiet, persistent power of human connection, the unexpected strength of a learned language, and the undeniable truth in the women's voices. He decided, in that moment, not to punish the soldiers. Instead, he made a quiet, unwritten decision. He would reassign them quietly to other duties, ensuring their actions would not be officially recorded as a disciplinary breach. And crucially, he would subtly endorse the continuation of similar rehabilitation efforts throughout the camps, recognizing their intrinsic, undeniable value. The order was not to stop. It was merely to operate with more discretion. The immediate aftermath of the general's inspection saw a profound, if understated, shift within the camps. The clandestine English lessons, once a risky act of defiance, now flourished with a tacit, unspoken approval. The fear of reprimand lessened, replaced by a quiet determination among the soldiers and a renewed zeal among the women. The women, armed with their growing vocabulary and improving grammar, were better equipped than ever to interact with the myriad relief agencies that descended upon the post-war landscape. They could articulate their harrowing stories directly to war crimes investigators, bypassing often insensitive interpreters. They could make informed choices about their repatriation to their homelands, or for many about their resettlement in new, unfamiliar lands. Hannah, with her quick mind and empathetic spirit, became an invaluable informal interpreter, assisting fellow survivors in navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of relief efforts. Tommy, Miller, and Rodriguez, though eventually reassigned to other duties, left behind a self-sustaining program, having ignited a spark of hope and literacy that continued to spread like wildfire. Many women, empowered by their new language skills, were able to seek formal education, secure employment, and, critically, assume active roles as advocates for other survivors, breaking the insidious cycle of shame and silence. Over the decades that followed, the remarkable story of these women and their unexpected English lessons rippled outwards, gradually permeating through their communities, across nations, and eventually into the annals of history. Many of them, through the sheer force of their will, and the foundational tools they had acquired, used their language skills to become teachers, dedicated to educating the next generation. Others became entrepreneurs, building new lives from the ashes of their past, or powerful activists, relentless in their pursuit of justice and recognition for the plight of comfort women. They had, each in their own way, broken the crushing cycle of shame and silence. Their testimonies, delivered directly in English to international forums and human rights organizations, played a crucial, undeniable role in the global efforts to acknowledge and seek justice for comfort women, ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten. The ripple effect of those initial whispered lessons extended across generations, inspiring second and third descendants who proudly carried forward the legacy of their resilient foremothers, celebrating their quiet triumph over unimaginable adversity. Today, the modern echo of those lessons resonates deeply in the ongoing global advocacy for survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones. The story stands as a poignant testament to the often overlooked, yet profound power of education and language as fundamental tools for healing, for rebuilding shattered lives, and for empowering those who have been systematically dispossessed of their agency. Documentary filmmakers, meticulous historians, and tireless human rights organizations continue to cite these early, unofficial efforts as compelling examples of how individual acts of profound compassion, of simple human decency, can have monumental, far-reaching, and ultimately transformative impacts on human dignity and the pursuit of justice. The memory of Hannah and her comrades, of Tommy and his fellow GIs, serves as a powerful and enduring reminder that even in the darkest, most desolate corners of human history, light can, and often does, emerge from the most unexpected places, frequently kindled by the simplest, most profound, and most human of gestures. In the ruins of war, amidst the ashes of countless shattered lives, the greatest act of liberation wasn't just physical freedom from captivity, but the precious, undeniable gift of a voice. What small act of defiance or kindness have you witnessed that changed someone's life forever? Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories from World War II that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history, and remind us all of the enduring power of compassion and words.